Last week was one of the biggest weekends in Disney Lorcana to date. In the same exact weekend, we had a 175 player event in Valley Forge Casino in Greater Philadelphia. And across the pond in Normandy, France, we had 247 players play there as well. It was a really large event, and honestly, so much to cover in this week's meta breakdown that we even got some of the little guys in there with only 30 or 40 players in their 1Ks. But hey, we try to give everybody some love on this. So let's get into it today. We have a lot of decks to cover, and here is, of course, the full meta breakdown. Let's go. The best decks in week 3 into the Inklands metagame. Ruby Amethyst finished the weekend with 21 top 8 victories or top 16s, depending on the cut of a tournament. Ruby Sapphire finished with 9. Emerald Amethyst finished with 5. Amethyst Steel finished with 5. Amber Steel finished with 4. Emerald Steel 4. Ruby Amber 4. Sapphire Steel 3. And Amber Amethyst 1. So last weekend, 0 Ruby Sapphire decks. This weekend, there's 9. Now, there's a lot to go into this. I covered it a little bit on the first meta report of this weekend about SEGCon that was released on Monday, but I had a lot to say about this deck. I'm going to give it its own due time. We're going to cover one of the most successful decks from the France event in this video, and then at the end of the video, we're also covering the most recent Pixelborn data, trying to cover all my bases going into this really large weekend again, because this weekend we have over 200 players pre-registered for an 8K in Georgia. So there's a lot of information that's out there. These deck lists can be found all over the place, but specifically I got most of mine from inkdecks.com. So definitely check them out. All in all, a lot of decks here, 56 different individuals. Yes, Ruby Amethyst still leading its way on top, but you can see a pretty clear diversity here with 3 or more from every one of these decks except for Amber Amethyst. And then at the end of the day, we're seeing a resurgence or a rise in Ruby Sapphire when that deck's been really quiet throughout the first few weeks. So it's interesting to see that this deck kind of come out swinging, and we're going to talk about all the adaptations. So yes, Ruby Amethyst still holding its stake on the metagame. In all honesty, guys, it's now crazy enough one of the cheapest decks in the game. The deck that I registered last weekend was only $152, which is kind of ridiculous for a deck that is this good. But all in all, I think it's just because the consistency of it is still there. A lot of people actually do enjoy playing that play style. And although the deck is ironically a really fair deck, it's fair in a manner that it has the ability to answer so many different threats within the metagame. And it's going to stay that way probably for a while. But you can see that there's other decks now creeping up on the metagame and really kind of showing some interest in dethroning Ruby Amethyst. Hasn't happened yet. We're going to have to see and wait a couple more weeks to see if that is the occurrence here. Because even last weekend in wins, 3 of the 4 biggest tournaments held last weekend were won by Ruby Amethyst decks. So let's take a moment. Let's get into it. A lot of cool decks on this one. Let's get into it. So this was the first place Ruby Amethyst deck played by a player known as Reclam. This was in the Illuminary event held in Normandy, France. 247 players down to a top 16. What I really love about this deck, we talked about it a little bit in the interview with George this week, but there are 2 Maui Whales. Maui the Whale is a 7 cost, 8 strength, 8 willpower, 1 lore character with 2 separate abilities. The first ability is this character cannot ready at the start of your turn. And the second is you may pay 2 resources to ready this character. However, he cannot quest this turn when you do that. So for an 8/8 stat stick, being a problematic character for any steel deck because the removal just isn't there, having the ability with his Maui's Fishhook, you're able to take out legitimately every character in the game without even blinking. You can also take out multiple locations in a given turn as well, due to the ability that you can just freely utilize Maui's Fishhook and then pay 2 to ready him, swing, take out a castle, ready him again, swing, take out an RLS Legacy. Against the blue decks, you can take out multiple McDuck's Manors. So the card can definitely just straight up solo any locations in the game with the addition of Maui's Fishhook. Aside from the addition of Maui, this deck pretty much is a very stock heavy list. We are now seeing players feature this ability of having 2 Minnie Mouse and 2 Olaf rather than having the 4 of 1. A lot of this is kind of incentivizing the idea that your deck might have more than just 8 1-drops, letting your opponent consider certain play lines later on in the game, and really just utilizing that information to just kind of leave your opponent guessing. This particular player was back on 4 Maleficent Monstrous Dragons. We've seen this card go in and out of deck list over the course of the last few weeks. We've seen 0, we've seen 1, 2, 3, and now 4. I believe that this is going to be really dependent on your local metagame and the metagame that you're kind of preparing for. I think the card is obviously very good against the grindier matchups like Blue Steel, like Sapphire, Ruby, and things to that nature. So because of that, Maleficent Monstrous Dragon will find its home again. For a while there, we thought that the format was going to be too fast for the dragon, but it's showing that most of your games are not ending that quickly. The dragon really being good at removing some of the more problematic characters in the game, whether it's Cinderella, whether it's the shiny crab. The list can honestly go on to where this character really can do a big number and be an impactful card in play. Having that 7 strength, being able to trade out for castles evenly is another kind of high mark for the wonderful dragon here. The spellbook very well may end up being a staple in most of these decks moving forward. The mirror match can take an eternity with the amount of 1-for-1 trading going around through the games. So having a spellbook, just putting a natural clock on the mirror match or the more grindier matches that just don't have the item removal will really go a long way in kind of just grinding out the games much more quickly. This deck was able to take down a 247 player event, Ruby Amethyst remaining on top, showing its dominance. And really, congratulations to this player. 247 players is a phenomenal number, and taking home that victory must feel remarkable. This deck finished in the top 4 of the Illuminary event as well. It was played by Caillou. This deck is really been evolving over the last couple weeks in different manners. But you can see here, this is a list that's featuring Montanui, featuring McDuck Manor, featuring the Queen of Hearts and Stitch, Little Rocket, along with Hey Hey. All of these characters can come in and do wonderful things on turn 3, where most of the time before, I would say in your non-aggro matchups, you're very content putting Montanui in play, letting it gain you some slow lore, while then building up with Fishbone Quill and things like that. This also gives you the route against aggressive decks to where on turn 2, you play Montanui. Now your opponent has to make a choice. Can he remove the Montanui or not? And if he can, if he just decides to go questing, you actually get to put your Queen or your Stitch into play, move it to Montanui, take out an opposing character, and then gain the resource, which is basically acting as a rush detective mini in that fashion. So you get to remove a character from your opponent's side of the play and then still gain your resource return, which is definitely a nice play line against aggressive strategies. Stitch also being able the ability to kind of freely trade up very well against a lot of the metagame, while being stuck on a Montanui for added bonus of gating the resource, is really a character that I think has been underplayed in many decks. Ruby Amethyst doesn't necessarily have room for it, but I would expect to see it more and more in decks like Ruby Sapphire or even Amber Ruby. Hey Hey is another addition. Hey Hey has the ability to, it's inkable, which is nice, but against those aggressive strategies again, you can play Montanui on 2 and then play Hey Hey on 3 and move Hey Hey to Montanui to where you'll end up getting a trade for it on turn 4 most likely, but you also took a lure away from your opponent, which is effectively kind of time walking them against certain matchups that don't have the 2 lore questers early on. The Sumerian Talisman is another card that we spoke about in recent weeks that has really becoming less of a flavor of the week and more of a potential staple in these decks. Again, trying to get the most out of your characters is really showing to be worthwhile when all of your characters with Rush can come in, remove a card, and then potentially go to your inkwell and also potentially draw a card is really just the synergistic way of trying to get the most out of everything. And even when the card is just kind of sitting in play and doing nothing, you can very easily end up hiring it away, pick up another couple of cards, and not feel too bad about it. And then, of course, later on, pick it back up with the shiny crab that everyone's starting to find more favor in again. The card seems a bit out of place in general, but being its inkable nature and finding its way into this control-ish strategy, utilizing your mid-range characters to take out opposing boards and then draw you cards effectively, is definitely showing to be a worthwhile investment. I will say this deck, I think from last week to this week has had the biggest change in general. This version of the deck doesn't have lucky dimes. I've been seeing decks in hardcore Pixelborn mode with up to 3 lucky dimes now. So while this version will probably continuously evolve and really start playing that Ruby Amethyst mindset of saying, hey, I'm likely a 50 card deck and my last 10 cards are interchangeable. I believe Ruby Sapphire is starting to prove that they have the card pool to do that as well, which is going to keep opponents on edge, not really knowing how to close out games against the opponent or be weary of how that opponent may choose to close out games against you. The locations are great, but it's also proving that everything with Maui's Fishhook might leave yourself vulnerable to the Ruby Amethyst matchups. Now, with Lucky Dime, well, Ruby Amethyst doesn't have an answer to Lucky Dime. So because of that, you can kind of put your Lucky Dime in play, and it feels really safe in that matchup. And in matchups where it's not as good, if Benjins come back, if Rise of the Titans, go up in on favor, if more people started playing Judy Hops, when in doubt, you can just Fishbone and Quill it away, so you're not stuck with a 7-cost uninkable in your hand. All in all, I think this deck will continue to evolve moving forward, and I think there's a good chance it's going to continue to be a very successful deck. From a market spot, if you haven't picked up Lucky Dimes yet, I think they're still under $5. It might be a good week to go buy your playset of Lucky Dimes because it's possible that card might actually go up in value. Just a tip. Maybe it won't work. I don't know, but I would rather you spend $5 on getting them each rather than spending $10 or $15 in a week or two. Just my tip for you. Next deck. Emerald Amethyst Aggro is another deck that's been really just kind of in and out of the metagame each week. I think that this deck is showing its worth more and more. But what I will say is that with the addition of Ruby Sapphire within the metagame, there's a good chance that Emerald Amethyst might have a real stock to it. Having multiple different control decks kind of being problems for most of the steel decks puts this deck in a pretty good position. If this deck is able to get out from under all the steel decks and get away and have them kind of drift off to the side because of the increase of Sapphire Ruby matchups that the steel decks have true problems against, then this deck might really be a kind of a paper to the rock format where, that deck, if they don't respect the aggro enough, if Ruby Amethyst and Sapphire Ruby remove Teeth and Ambitions from their deck, if they play less characters in the early game to kind of combat with your trading and things like that, if you can really get the most out of your kit Cloud Kickers, it'll go a long way. Neither Ruby Sapphire or Ruby Amethyst have the best answers to Ursula Deceiver of all, which is a problem. Your Ursula Deceiver also gets to pick apart the grab your swords. I should say more importantly, the be prepared. So you can really just decide to go wide after an Ursula pick if you can get a good be prepared out of their hand. I think this deck, in all honesty, moving into this week, if you're an aggro player and you really lean into that play style, I believe Emerald Amethyst might be the deck of choice this weekend, just because I think a lot of people are starting to see the hype with Ruby Sapphire. A lot of people are already feeling safe with Ruby Amethyst. And now the Ruby Amethyst players are trying to modify their deck to be even more better in the control mirrors. And because of that, they have to take cuts somewhere and they have to remove cards somewhere. And when they start doing that, it gives you even more opportunity to catch them off guard in weeks like that. So if I was an aggro player, I would be pretty excited for this weekend. I think there's a good chance that we're going to see some real success out of the Emerald Amethyst deck list this weekend. Speaking of steel, Amethyst Steel finished in 4th place this week. This is a list that, in all honesty, was all over SCGCon. For me, I had played at least 1 or 2 of these in every event at Star City. There was only one successful one all weekend, which I found really shocking that they were just incapable of getting in. But really, what I think that comes down to is I believe this deck, when relying too much on the Jafar combo, is actually taking too long to win games. And because of that, it's incapable of winning a true best of 3. Generally speaking, it's winning a game and then maybe losing its game on the draw. And then game 3 is unable to finish because your deck isn't really situated well to aggro out opponents unless you can find multiple Robin Hoods or Robin Hood and Tinkerbells very early on in matches to kind of threaten the board a little bit better before Maui and Be Prepared can really take control. I honestly think Amethyst Steel might end up being very sneaky good. And here's why. I think that Emerald Steel and Sapphire Steel and even Amber Steel might start falling out of favor because their matchups into Ruby Sapphire Popsicle list is just not very good. And it's really difficult for you to truly get over that hump of that matchup. But this deck can still function as that mid-range deck with a combo aspect. And if the Ruby Sapphire decks aren't respecting you enough and they don't have enough answers, then you might be able to lean into playing a few more Jafars in your deck. Because that, if you can just get away with playing just a few more Jafars, maybe 10, so maybe just 2 more Jafars added into this deck, what I think that does for you is that it really says on, a potential 2 or 3 turns in a row, you might just be like, play my Jafar, go, and your opponent has to answer it. And if they don't, you may be able to just threaten so much lore that they just lose the game because they can't come back from it. I think this deck, having the ability to have the combo and forcing opponents to always have to respect it, might be the reason why it actually survives. The problem I have with it is maybe in the current metagame, it was too wishy-washy and you had to make too many small incremental decisions. So that might have been what's holding it down. But right now, if we just lean into being this control combo deck and having a real effective way to close out games and win games, it might be in a really good position. Hard to say just yet, but what I do think that of the steel decks, this has the potential to rise to the top in the current situation going on within the metagame. Time will tell. If you're a Jafar fan, let me know. I love playing this deck. It's so much fun. Last weekend really was massive in terms of overall tournaments played and players in tournaments. 110-person player event, 175-player event, 247-player event. I mean, that's awesome for Disney Lorcana. If you love Disney Lorcana and you attended these events and you're looking forward to more events coming on and around in your area, definitely hit the like button because I am with you. I'm a little jealous of everyone going to Atlanta this weekend. There's an 8K in Atlanta. I'll put a graphic here if you guys don't know about it. I do think it's being streamed. I'll definitely confirm that also maybe in the description because I forget right now. But all in all, it's great because they already have over 200 players registered for this tournament. That's awesome. I can't wait to follow along. I can't wait to see it. It's a very exciting time for Disney Lorcana. The growth has been great, and I'm looking forward to it. Let me know in the comments how you're feeling about this metagame. Are you the kind of player that is upset because everything is kind of good and you don't know what to play? Or are you the kind of player that's excited to be able to play whatever you think is good and whatever you like and feel kind of okay with about that in the metagame? I do think that right now it's pretty spread. I know Ruby Amethyst is still towering over other decks right now, and it still looks to be the best thing that you can play and the most educated decision. Obviously, my whole team decided that Ruby Amethyst was the most educated decision last week, -1 player. I understand all those things, but I also think that we're seeing a lot of decks come in, really grow over the course of the weeks, and really start to show up and show out. And I'm very curious if we start to see even more of that moving forward. Let's get into the rest of the decks. Shout out to a good friend of mine, Scoop Phase. I actually met this player this weekend officially, but he's been hanging out on our Discord for a few weeks. This deck finished in top 16 of the 175-player event in Philadelphia last weekend. A win away from making top 8, in all honesty. In the 5K itself, I believe that Amber Steel wasn't really that successful across the board. I actually was unaware that Scoop Phase was so close to making top 8 until he reported about it in our Discord, and then I saw him pop up on Inkdex. And it's really interesting on the weekend. Amber Steel did have a couple top 8s in the smaller events, but to say that we were able to be in top 16 of a 175 player tournament, I think speaks volumes about the potential for this deck in general. Being on the Lanterns again, that deck, that's been a card that we've seen come in and out of these decks. It's interesting to see them kind of come back into favor. I think the biggest factor here is that the Cinderella Stout Heart has really been proven to be a problem for a lot of the metagame. There just isn't very good answers to her. Her ability to attack ready characters has become more and more important at closing out games, and definitely about coming from behind in games, which has been nice to see that card really utilize that ability. As before, it was more of just a, hey, I'm going to resist 2/5/5 that lures for 3. That's not the case anymore. This card really is becoming a problem and a threat to most of the characters in the metagame. At its core, this deck is playing a little more of the fair mid-range that I have seen in most, where we've seen versions of this deck that are leaning on even more ways to shift early to a whole new world early to kind of frustrate your opponent's curve and potential hands that they mulligan for, really just getting ahead of your opponent in resources very quickly. But this version looks to be playing a more fair and more like straightforward mid-range and utilizing a whole new world when it's best for them rather than when it's worst for your opponent, if that makes sense. Uh, all of the new cards in this deck are really very powerful. Bare Necessities, Along Came Zeus, Robin Hood, all of these cards are really playing their roles. I think Robin Hood is going under the radar as one of the most powerful cards in the actual set of Into the Inklands. The amount of games that I lost this weekend to a turn 3 Robin Hood that was able to maybe sing a song, maybe remove a character, and on top of that, probably quest as well before I could get rid of it is pretty surreal. The card is just so good. It does so much. It feels so very similar to how Tinkerbell felt in Chapter 1. Well, of course, Tinkerbell is still a very good card now. In Chapter 1, it felt like everything Tinkerbell did was so unfair. It's starting to feel like everything that Robin Hood can do is also very unfair. Shout out again to Scoop Phase, top 16, 170 player event. Hell of a day for you. Would have been nice to see another friendly face get in top 8, but hey, you still should not be too upset with yourself for the top 16 finish in one of the biggest events in North America this year. I'd like to give a special shout out to James. In Sunday's event, I was kind of in a weird bracket. I took a draw in round 3, an unintentional draw in round 3. And because of that, it put me in a really weird bracket, and my tiebreakers weren't good because I actually ended up getting paired down not once, but twice in the tournament. So when we got into our round 6 match, I looked at the standings and I'm like, oh, I'm in 15th place. My tiebreakers are like 47%. And my opponent that I'm being paired into is a 54%. I'm like, there's just no way that if everything goes well, I'm going to make top 8. Even if I win this, I'll probably finish in 9th or 10th. And then I'll feel bad about it because it's like, it doesn't really matter. So because of that, I, as a competitive player, will almost never take a top 8 away from a player if I can help it. And that's really how I feel about that. And I know I'm different from other ones. I know everyone's like, oh my God, I want to win. I want to finish top 16. I want to do my very best. I'm in a mindset where if I can't make a top cut in a tournament, then I no longer need to be in the tournament. So all weekend long for me, I was never at a negative win record. I was 2-1-1 in Friday event. I was 3-2 in the Saturday event. And then I was 3-1-1 in this event. And in all 3 of those events, I realized that I probably couldn't make the top cut. So because of that, I just dropped from the event. I didn't realize it until we were about to sit down to play in our round 6 that this was going to be true. So when we sat down, I looked at James and said, hey, James, I can't make top 8. And if there's any chance that you can, I want to give you the best opportunity to do so. So I conceded to him and gave him a chance to make top 8. Well, because I conceded to him, what ended up happening is a little crazy, but there ended up being an unintentional draw in the final round by 2 players above him. And because of that, both of those players ended at 12 points, and he ended at 13 points, making it into top 8. Now, granted, had we played, had I won, I would have also been in that same spot because it never went to 12 points. It stayed at 13. So everyone with 13 or more points did make it. That's okay. I'm not upset about it. It is what it is. I made my decision, my best educated choice in the situation, assuming everything goes correctly. But what really made my day as a player, as a person, as a creator, all of those things, that James came up to me and said, "Thank you so very much for conceding. I got lucky. There was an unintentional draw, and because of it, I made top 8." And he went to the extent of saying that I made his weekend. I'm so grateful that I was able to give that to a player. If that was his first top 8 in a Disney Lorcana event of that scale, even better. It's a total win for me. I'm so excited that he got to play and experience the top 8 and really maybe even get his first top 8 in competitive card game play for Disney Lorcana. Shout out to you, James. Let's talk about your deck. The Emerald Steel Bucky list, if anyone hasn't listened to the George interview yet, was the one deck that George did not want to play against all weekend, and I have to agree. The only other time that I played against Emerald Steel on the weekend was round 1 of the Saturday 5K. And game 1, my opponent kind of crushed me. Game 2, I kind of crushed him. And then game 3, my opponent went Robin Hood, Bucky, Bucky. And when you do that against Ruby Amethyst, it's really difficult to lose. So full Bucky discard is definitely a problematic line for a lot of decks in the game. There just is not an answer to a 1/1 ward character for most decks. You have to be committed to playing Tiny Tactician and Tinkerbell, or where you have to shift Robin Hood and play Grab Your Swords to remove it. So while Steel has a lot of options to potentially remove Bucky early, mostly every other deck in the game cannot answer that card until turn 7 with a Be Prepared. So any player on full Bucky discard that might be losing games, my number one tip for you is to act as if your Bucky is an item with ward. Never quest with it. Never make it vulnerable. Just be comfortable with your card sitting in play and doing its job, which is making your opponent discard a card every single time you play a Floodborn character. Aside from that, I think this deck really is just straightforward. There's nothing crazy about it. The Hercules is something a little different. It's definitely a card I had not seen a bunch of, but that's what Morph offers you. Morph offers you the ability to play all of these different Floodborns and utilize them all in different ways. Having the ability to play a turn 2 Morph over a turn 2 Bucky, in most cases not correct because you want to get Bucky in play and online, but when it's your backup plan, it's a pretty good backup plan. Giving you additional ways to shift in Robin Hood or the Beast on turn 3 is awesome. Having a way to unexpectedly shift in Tinkerbell or even Hercules definitely goes a long way as well. I think this deck is one of the more interesting decks in the format, and Bucky really is probably one of the biggest problem characters for the format as well. So because of that, I do think this deck will remain to have a place. My biggest fear is that the deck might be too fair for the metagame. So you might have to struggle or kind of be in an uphill battle to win some of your games when you don't see your default Bucky on turn 2. And it's even to the point where, like, if Bucky is not in your opening hand at all, you should probably be full mulling 7 to get that card in your hand, because that's how powerful and detrimental he is to your honest script and plan for this deck. All in all, shout out to James again. Congratulations on your top 8, and I look forward to seeing you at another event. All right, so let's talk about Amber Ruby for a second. Before I get into the full scope of this, I want to give a little bit of a preface to this. So first and foremost, I want to give a shout out to my opponent here, Christy C. From Portland, Oregon, who flew all the way to SCG to hang out with family, but also get in some games of Disney Lorcana at SCGCon Philadelphia. Now, what's interesting about this particular matchup here that we're going to discuss is I was playing Ruby Amethyst on Friday. I played it all weekend, but I was playing it on Friday, and I was in the 2-1-1 bracket, and I got the pair down to the 2-2, which happened to be Christy here. Now, Christy wins the die roll, and we're playing the game, and I'm kind of seeing what her deck is doing, and I'm kind of understanding it. And when I realized that it's about on turn 5, maybe turn 6 of the game, I had figured out that I was literally incapable of winning. And when I mean that like in a really good way. Like I was almost excited by the idea that this deck existed and that I had no answer for it. So we played our games. She beat me 2-0. And right before I conceded in game two, I said, "Hey, Chris, I'm going to concede, but I would really love to see your deck list so I can talk about it on the meta report." And lucky for me, she obliged and she gave me her deck list. So this is her deck list that she played in that tournament. She was honestly ended up beating me again on Sunday in the 2-0 bracket. So she started Sunday 3-0. She finished in top 16 in the Sunday tournament. She didn't do as well in the other events with this deck, but it is a bit unrefined, I think. And it's one of those decks where it is very good into Ruby Amethyst. There's no doubt about that. I don't know exactly how good it is into the rest of the field, but we have seen more and more of these Amber Ruby decks pop up recently. And because of that, I wanted to first shout her out before I talked about the top 16 deck that I want to get into next. But thank you, Christy, for completely kicking my ass, showing me a new deck that I was unexperienced with. And coming from me, in Chapter 1, Amber Ruby was my favorite color combination. And I think if there was another month of Chapter 1 metagame, it would have been one of the better decks in the meta. But we just didn't have enough time for develop. We didn't have enough big tournaments for it to be showcased at. So I was very excited to see this deck really, really work. So let's talk about the deck that Scott played in the tournament on Sunday. So Scott Landis finished in top 16 of the 1K on Sunday. He went 4-2 with this list. And this was a modified version of what Christy was playing. Now, the key factors of this is that we've been seeing more and more Mufasa Amber Ruby decks, but we definitely have not seen any of them focused around Heart of Atlantis. Heart of Atlantis is a 4-cost uninkable that just reads, exert this. The next character you play this turn costs 2 less. And of course, this works just like Lantern, so it also works for shift cost. Now, we can see here in this deck, we're not playing Pongos, we're just playing Docks. And what we're really trying to do is utilize the big game threats to play out all earlier and as early as playing 7-cost characters on turn 5. Now, with Doc, if we're able to play turn 3 Doc, turn 4 Heart, we can actually quest with Doc and then we can follow up with a card like Pongo. What a turn 4 Heart also allows is that if you're able to kind of like stave off the early game with Mother Gothels, with Queen of Hearts, and really not put yourself in too far behind in games, Heart on turn 4 enables a turn 5 Scar. And what Scar can do is basically against the aggro decks, he can completely come in, remove every card that your opponent just quest it with, and then just be like, yeah, okay, thanks, let's move forward in the game, because next turn, I'm just going to play another bomb. This deck really, really was favorable into the Ruby Amethyst matchup. Over the course of the weekend, I played against 2 different versions of this list, one version with Heart and one version without. I can tell you the matches that I played against, the versions that did not have Heart of Atlantis, were absolutely different matchups. I think I 2-0'd both of my opponents on decks without Heart, and the opposite happened to me, that where the opponents that I played that did have Heart completely crushed me, and I went 4-1. The one game that I did play, I had to kind of try in a completely different play line, but even make myself vulnerable to the turn 5 Scar, and I only think I won the game because Christy simply didn't have it. I think if you're talking about going into a very heavy Ruby Amethyst metagame, I got some good news for you. This deck crushes it. I mean, like, crushes it. Like, it is crazy how good and how powerful this deck is into Ruby Amethyst. So if you're really stuck in that vibe and you're stuck in a world of Ruby Amethyst decks, I suggest you should pick up this list and play it. It's very good. It's very powerful. And your Ruby Amethyst opponents are going to be like, what do I do? One more time, shout out to Christy. Awesome set of games throughout the weekend, and you were such a good sport about it. Thank you so much for sharing your list and giving Scott the ability to have the chance to play with it on Sunday. Good luck moving forward, and I look forward to seeing you again. Man, have we fallen. Sapphire Steel has fallen so far out of favor in the metagame from being one of the most played and powerful and successful decks in set 2 to really just falling down. Across the weekend, there was only 3 of these in top 8s across the different events that they were at. There was only 1 of these in top 16. at the Illuminary event here, but this finished in top 8. There was only one of them in the entirety of SCG weekend. So this deck is really falling out of favor, and I do think it has to do with the uptick in Ruby Sapphire. I do think that there's a good chance that if there's not an aggressive amount of decks in the format, the Ruby Sapphire deck is just better into this deck and most of the steel decks. So if this deck is kind of playing the role of being the most controlling steel deck and really leveraging that against all the other steel decks and then leveraging that against the aggro decks, it really had a good place in the metagame. The problem is now is that if it has two matchups that it's really not that great into, if we're not more than 50-50 against Ruby Amethyst and we're like 40-60 against Ruby Sapphire, then it starts to become really difficult to play this deck. And while the list we have here on screen is pretty stock, there's nothing crazy about this. There's nothing really that different. It really is just kind of what the, stock version of this list, I would say, looks like. This is the kind of deck that knows what it's doing, knows what the plan is, and is just looking to execute the plan as greatly as possible. And that's good for straightforward gameplay, but it's bad when the matchups that you want to see don't exist anymore because there's two other decks in the game. They're kind of lowering them down. So when all that starts to happen, this deck starts to fall out of favor. And when that starts to happen, then you have to start looking at going, how can I really adjust this to make it different? And I think right now, the answer is be prepared is better. And if be prepared is better, then grab your swords. Then you kind of have to get away from it. If Zeus isn't good enough, if Tinkerbell's not good enough, if the whole new world is actually making your opponents better than you because they're positioning themselves better in the game, that's also a huge problem. So I'll be curious to see how Sapphire Steel survives the next few weeks. I'm definitely worried about it in general. I'm not sure that this list is going to remain a top tier deck moving forward. And I don't know. Time will tell. We'll see. Last week, there was an Amber Amethyst in a top 8. We couldn't find the deck list. This week, we did get one at the Games Grid Lorcana 1K, a double case tournament played by Tanner Y. Really awesome to see Neverland in this list. I think we talked about it a few weeks ago as cards to play. Picking up a 1-cost Inkable that can represent 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 different lore is awesome. Having the Lilos, having the Maleficents, Pascal's, Kaida. This deck is pedal to the metal. Having the protection of the Shift Kaida as another way to kind of get around things. Utilizing Zimba, utilizing Baloo. This deck really is just, hey, I'm going to put my dudes in play. I'm going to turn them sideways. I'm going to pressure the board. I have cards like Befuddle to bounce things back, prevent my opponent from utilizing that. I can also put my own cards back in my hand with Befuddle. This deck really, really is just saying, I'm going to pressure you as quickly as possible, and you better have the answers. And if you don't, I'll be at 20 lore before you even get to turn 5. All in all, I really want to get this list in there. Don't want to talk about it too much because, honesty, it is a super straightforward deck. It's just guys in play, turn them sideways, gain my lore, utilizing Neverland to a little bit of a greater ability, having the spellbook finish, having the rabbits, the goats, all of those things to really finish out games, having the double bodyguards. This deck really just is as straightforward can be. I think it's great for any new player to pick up a deck like this. And I think it comes in at the low price of $110, which is phenomenal. And we can make a debate that you don't even need Kaida, if we're being honest. So that's probably some of the cost into that. So if you don't even need Kaida, this deck probably gets even cheaper. All in all, shout out to you, Tanner, and congrats on your top 8 finish. All right, so I know we don't talk a whole ton about Pixelborn Data, but the last couple weeks have really been showcasing things in a very interesting manner. So I wanted to touch on it really quick at the end here and kind of discuss how I think it's really playing into results of potential paper tournaments as well. So we can see here 11,000 games were played in the top 100 player for the data, and it's pretty well-rounded. Yeah, 2,500 games by Queen's Castle Control, which is not really shocking, but, we have 3 other decks that have over 1,100 games, Steel Song, McDuck Manor Control, and Ramp A Whole New World Control, which is great for the game. All of the win rates really across everything is pretty good. You can see 52%, 51%, 51%, 53%, 59%, which I believe is the Jafar deck. 53% for Emerald Amethyst Tempo deck. So some of the games that we're seeing played by lower lower amount of games obviously normally have higher win rate. And I think that's really due to specific players playing that deck well, as opposed to a broad version of players playing the deck well. Like even like Ruby Amethyst here and a whole new world ramp and McDuck Manor, all of those decks coming in about 51, 52% win rate. It also comes across as new players picking the deck up for the first time, learning the deck in ranked mode, and kind of taking probably plenty of losses with the deck because of it, which is why I think you see it evened out, where some of these higher win rates are coming from lower played decks, with less people playing it. Maybe 300 players, 300 games might be from 2 or 3 players, as an example for the Ruby Sapphire Other, which could be the lucky dime version of that deck type scenario. So this week also released a new mode in Pixelborn with the Pixelborn Hardcore mode. And to explain that real quickly, it's climb the ladder and become the very best. This is ELO-based rank play. The matchmaking and ladder are based on players' ELO. Matchmaking might take longer than usual in an attempt to find the perfect opponent. This is a best of 3 mode. Points are rewarded at the end of the final game. You need to play at least 10 games before your ELO starts updating. Players' ELO resets at the end of each season. So this week on the interview with the 5K winner, George, if you haven't yet, definitely check out the interview. We talked about this at the very beginning, this new mode in Pixelborn for players. I do think from, competitive player to the world, in all honesty, a mode like this better represents the more likelihood of a tournament setting. You shouldn't know what your opponent's playing before you sit down. It's not part of the rules of Lorcana. There's no part of the rules of Lorcana that say, hey, before we play the game, I tell you my ink combination so you can mulligan better. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. But it does exist in just the regular ranked mode of Pixelborn now. When the game starts, it tells you what your opponent's ink combination is. That's not representing the game very well, right? That's just helping you mulligan better for whatever reason that I don't even know why it's necessary. I don't think it should be a part of the game, period. But hey, it is what it is. But this doesn't represent that. The other thing it represents is a best of 3 scenario. So with the best of 3 scenario, you're going to get more than one game an opponent. Whereas in ranked mode, 9 out of 10 times your opponent declines your rematch because they don't want to play against you again, yada, yada, who knows? Or they're just looking to play games quickly, who the hell knows? So all of those things in this ranked mode really represents a true tournament setting. And in all honesty, because of the way the ELO builds, the leaderboard isn't based on games. It is really based on success within your bracket of like-minded players and like skill level players. So for us, no discredit to anybody playing the Pixelborn ranked ladder mode. I just never really held the stats warranted because it was way more just about the amount of games that you played, really, than it was win percentages. This is different. This ladder mode will represent some of the best players on Pixelborn. Now, I say that discreetly, right? Like, this is only Pixelborn. Not everybody plays Pixelborn. Not everybody grinds Pixelborn. Some people just utilize it as like the custom mode for testing, for tournaments and things like that. But for the Pixelborn ladder, the hardcore mode will definitely prove who the best Pixelborn players are. I think that this is a great thing for the game in general. It'll put great stocks in players that want to commit to this mode. And I think it'll be great resource information for competitive players in tournaments, for paper tournaments, because these are some of the best players really taking points back from one another, playing what they believe are the best decks. So I want to say personally, for me to Pavel, huge shout out to you for this mode. I think it's a great thing for competitive Disney Lorcana players. So thank you very much for including it. Long meta report, a lot of decks to cover, a lot of stuff to cover. Thank you so much for running through it with me. If you want to hear more about the other decks that were played and be successful this weekend, I covered basically all of SCGCon in this video here. And if you want to hear from the winner themselves, George, and really get some insight about the Ruby Amethyst gameplay, about the decisions of our team that we made, the discussions we had, how we came to what, some of his tips for the mirror matches, and really just a way to learn from a truly genuine person, you should check out this video right here. Thank you guys so much for watching today. If you haven't yet, hit that like button, and I will see you in the next video.